Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to have lots of tips on how to use PanPastels for backgrounds and how to keep the colours really bright and vibrant when working with pastel pencils. Now my first tip for working with PanPastels for your backgrounds is if you don't have any intention of working with your pastel pencils over the top and coming in with details, then just be more generous with the amount of PanPastel that we're applying here. Now what I want to be working on is just to primarily cover the paper colour that I am working from. So for this I'm just using a basic blocking in process with my chrome oxide green shade. This is one of my favourite greens in the PanPastels set. And then I'm adding in just a little bit of white to create the effect of a bokeh look. Now you'll see that I've left the outer edges clear for the time being, and this is more of a deliberate layering process because I'm going to create a bit of a vignette effect, as you can see from the photo of the finished drawing in the corner, and I'm incorporating more of my black in with the green. Now to make sure that the bokeh circles did not have a grey tint, I've made sure to keep my darker colours on the applicator for the last layer. Now this is something else that can really make a difference to the backgrounds when keeping a good colour saturation. So here I'm now darkening this up so that the lighter bokeh circles that I added initially didn't have a grey tint to them. If I can keep these light and dark colours separate, then I'm going to be able to keep more of that vibrancy in place. Now of course you can use two applicators or two sponges, one for your darker colour and one for your lighter colour. But I do just find working with this way, I'm not having to switch my sponges through as much, and it just makes that process a little bit easier. But of course there are many different ways to get to the same end, and different applicators, if that is your preference, is perfectly fine. But it is something to pay really close attention to because that grey mixed in with those lighter bokehs would give a very different look. Now the very last stage I like to do is just make sure that that pastel is pushed into the tooth of the paper, not using too much pressure with your finger, but just enough to give a nice smoother blend. Now I did want to incorporate some of the foliage here and have a bit more of a softer, slightly blurred effect for this as well. This would really emphasise more of the impact on the butterfly, have more of that focus there, and of course the contrast, which we are going to talk about later on in the video. But I'm still using my round soft tool, and this is where I'm hinting at the main lights and darks. I am going to be coming back in and tidying up this with my pastel pencils, so I'm being a little bit more careful about how much PanPastel I'm applying here for this stage. Now for the smaller areas of the flower up the top, I am going to switch over to using a small makeup applicator, and you can see here that we're able to be a little bit more precise, and it just makes using the PanPastels easier for these smaller elements. Now when I started to work with my pastel pencils here, I'm trying to just create that impression of softness, no detail, with that blurry effect. Now for the most part, you'll see that I'm holding my pastel pencils at the end of the barrel. Now this is always going to be my preference when I'm trying to create something that's more out of focus, because this automatically encourages us to use less pressure on the pencil. By avoiding those harsher lines, this is going to remain more of that out of focus blurry effect. It still enables me to capture those main lights and darks. Now to make sure that I've got separation on the leaves here compared to the background, you'll see that I'm using different shades of green. I'm making sure that the foreground areas are more vibrant, and then that background is a little bit darker and also a little bit cooler as well. Having this separation is going to give more of that focus to that main subject and really help to also push that background further away. Now one thing I talk about in all of my tutorials is the importance of building up the layers gradually. So you can see that I'm now starting to use a lighter blue and my white, but I've made sure to build these up in stages. I haven't jumped to my brightest highlights first. Now this is always important, but also working on something that is out of focus, having more of those in-between values and not jumping to the brighter highlights can help make that element look more blurry. So if we started with a base foundation and jumped straight into the brightest white, for example, then that highlight may look too bright and therefore too harsh, pulling focus to that area of the drawing. So by focusing on the midtones, it can really help the overall feel and depth of the piece. Now, another benefit of a pan pastel background like this is when there is an area of foreground that is also blurry, we can use the background pan pastel there to blend that foreground into it. So we're able to create more of that softness, whereas working with the background of a paper colour with no pastel can make it far harder to get this level of softness on the edges of the subject. So having some kind of pastel over the entire paper definitely has advantages, and when working with something as blurry as this, it can certainly make that layering process and blending technique much easier. Now, one tip when working with sections like this that are really bright, regardless if it was a background or the main subject, is I needed to make sure that I kept cleaning off the tip of the pencil because I didn't want any of the green of the background being accidentally picked up on the white tip of the pencil and pulled into the flower. I wanted to make sure that I keep that nice and clean. Now, this whole technique is something that I do focus on in the butterfly section of this video, and I'm going to have lots of tips on how to keep good colour saturation and sharp contrast. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to take my white Carbothello pencil and map in the lightest part of the wings first. These markings here, it would be the same with the highlight in the eye. Anything like that where it's really bright, it's always worth taking this step first just to make sure we've got high contrast right from the beginning. Now, a big tip at this stage is if you do have a subject like this that does have a lot of black there, I would recommend to leave that until the last stages once all of this is mapped in. If any of that black is mixed into, even accidentally on the tip of the pencil with the orange, it's going to create a very muddy look really quickly, and that can be very hard to fix. Now, when working with my vibrant colours, this would be the same when I draw fur. I want to start off with those to make sure that I've got that colour saturation in first. If I was, for example, to start off with the darker oranges here and try to add the vibrant orange and the yellow on top, I may not be able to get it as vibrant as it currently looks. So this is where I'm working a little bit more with my light to dark techniques. Now, when working with pastels, they are such a versatile medium that we can switch between light to dark application or dark to light. Once I've started with working with my vibrant colours and I'm happy with that, I'm going to come in and add a little bit more detail and definition, but the bulk of that colour is established. This is now where I can come in with a sharp black Carbothello and start to get those darker areas in. Now, this is a little bit more fiddly, but it does mean then that I've got my sharp contrast between the highlights and shadows. I want to be making sure that I've always got that high contrast. It's that makes something look realistic more so than the exact colour. This could have more of a duller orange. It may not necessarily be as vibrant, but as long as I've got my sharp contrast in, it will still look three-dimensional. Now, of course, in a piece like this, the vibrant colour saturation does help with that initial impact and wow factor of the drawing. It's why I wanted to focus both aspects on this tutorial. Now, the real-time tutorial really does focus this thoroughly. I have my voiceover whilst I'm drawing, so everything is explained in the moment. And if any of my step-by-step lessons are of interest, I'll link the information to those in the description below. Now, when I come back in with my sharp white pencil, this is where I'm being super careful to make sure that I'm not bringing in any of that black. This will turn grey very quickly, and I'm making sure to keep cleaning the tip of that pencil off whenever needed. I don't want to have any of that black pigment on the tip of that white pencil when I come back over my lighter areas. Now, this is where I'm taking the time, again with a sharper point, to make sure that I'm changing the colour or the value of those white markings just to add more depth and realism here. Not every white marking needs to be adjusted, and for the smallest ones here that would be very fiddly to work around, I've come back in and then added that on top. You can do this, but of course it's never going to be quite as bright as if the white was put down first. But for these really small dots, that would be really complicated to try to draw around every single one with the black pencils. So for those, especially on a smaller drawing like this, I find it quicker and effective by adding those over the top. You can see that they're still bright enough to have that impact, and I've got now a variation between how bright the lighter sections are compared to those little dots that I added on top. One of the biggest mistakes is to just use the same pencil for all highlights, and then that can make the drawing lack that depth and not have as much of that realism. So by adding the white in some cases over the black, it actually helps to make that look more realistic so that we don't end up with all the highlights looking the same. Now I mentioned previously about adding the black afterwards so that we didn't then have to come back in with the other pencils. But here with the yellows, oranges and a little bit of the white that I'm working with at the moment, I'm having to do this because I wanted to have a little bit more softness just slightly where the black met the orange shapes. This just made it again feel a little bit more realistic and have that extra level of depth that I really wanted for this piece. Although there are harsh start and stop points, we want that clarity between the colours. I didn't want it to look unfinished. And because Pastelmat is naturally a little bit more textured, it is my favourite paper for pastel drawings, but that texture can cause a little bit more grain in the edges here where we've got more of those harsher lines. So what I was doing with those pencils is actually very carefully going over those boundaries where the black was meeting up against the orange, and adding in a bit more of that darker orange just enabled a little bit more softness. It avoided that grainy look from occurring. It's almost like it helped to smooth it out a little bit. But what I wasn't doing is exaggerating those pencil strokes so that the black was coming into the orange. It was very, very precise. Now this level of softening control with the techniques, it is something that I did cover thoroughly in the real-time version of this tutorial. Now one last tip here for preventing any muddy colours is to make sure that we've got something resting under our hand, that we don't accidentally smudge those colours completely. Again, this can happen more easily with pastels because of the nature of the medium, but that semi-translucent sheet of paper that you can see under my hand is glassine. Now this is archival, it is acid free, it's also what I use to protect my work when I'm packaging or sending them out or storing them, and it works really well for preventing any of that pastel underneath from becoming merged and mixed together. Now one tip when working with glassine like this is it can actually pick up a little bit of pastel on the underside of that glassine where it's always in contact with the paper. So every now and then I will actually remove that glassine and use a microfiber cloth and run that across the back of that glassine paper just to get rid of that fine layer of pastel. Now in the whole scheme of things, that's not going to cause any real issues, but if you were working with something like this that had sharp darks and bright highlights, that could potentially pick up on the back and cause some degree of muddying up or smudging. Not anything that's going to be drastically obvious, but it is something that I do like to avoid. So just taking those couple of extra seconds to clean the back of the glassine can make a big difference with keeping the colours nice and pure and preventing any of those layers from getting just a little bit muddy. Now one last tip for keeping the areas nice and clean and tidy is to work with those sharper pencils. You'll see for the most part here my pencils are far sharper than they would be if I was drawing fur or feather, and this just means I can see exactly where those pencils are landing. It works really well for fine lines such as whiskers, but I want to be making sure for this that I just know that placement of those pencils is correct so that I'm less likely to have mistakes that I'm trying to fix later on. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to the real-time tutorial of this, then I can link all of the information to that in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.